Some people are squeamish about making large river overbets. I'm going to scare away villain if I bet too big, they often think to themselves. But if you want to win huge pots, which is essential to a strong win rate, sometimes you're going to have to seize the initiative and blow up those pots yourself on the last street of betting. For those that are reluctant to fire massive river bets, the solver can serve as an inspiration. You see, the solver is a very greedy bastard. It doesn't worry about whether or not its opponent will call. It simply fires off giant bets under the right conditions with both value and bluff, and this in turn forces villain to bluff catch with some portion of his range, because if he doesn't, then the solver's overbets would print money. So the next question is, what are these right conditions? Well, in this video, we're going to analyze a few recent hands I played where I overbet the river to see if we can identify some principles for the optimal situations to fire these sorts of bets. To do this, we're going to use DriveHUD 2's nifty R&D feature, which allows you to graphically analyze essentially any scenario along an almost infinite number of different parameters. So what we're looking at here are all of my river bets plotted on this chart, with the x-axis being the bet sizes I've used, and the y-axis being the net amount of big blinds I won off these bets. And as we can see, to date, I've won the most money by far with overbets. I've fired 37 river overbets, winning a massive 1,128 big blinds per 100 hands. And when we click on this point, it then filters for all the hands where I use this sizing so that we can analyze them further. Let's first take a look at the hand from the intro to this video by running a solve with the GTO check. So I started out with a small c-bet, mainly targeting ace highs, but villain called and the turn was the 9 of hearts. Villain checked and I decided to barrel 3/4 with my combo draw. All pretty ordinary to this point. Villain calls again, the river is the 10 of hearts. Villain checks for a third time and I have a decision. Of course I know I'm going to bet, but the question is, how much? How do I extract max value for luck boxing into the backdoor flush? Initially, I thought about making a slight overbet, but then I decided to shove. So how did I come to this decision? Well, putting aside my specific cards for the moment, let's first talk about the conditions under which making a massive overbet like this makes sense as a matter of principle. Generally, there are two primary circumstances that make for an ideal overbetting situation. The first is that you want to have a significant number of nuttish hands. That is, based on the action to that point, you should have a decent probability of holding a hand that can play for a very large pot. This is because in GTO land, combos tend to like to move in groups, which helps to disguise your cards. And in this case, I knew that I should have had a pretty major advantage in flushes. There were many hands that I would c-bet with a backdoor flush draw on the king high flop and then barrel on the heart turn, whereas the small blind should have raised a number of his strong suited hands pre-flop, folded a number of his backdoor flush draws to my flop c-bet, and also raised some of his flush draws on the turn. The second circumstance for an ideal overbetting situation is that you generally want villain to have a lot of middle strength hands, as these will be his primary bluff catchers. Generally speaking, a small blind cold calling range should be quite tight, filled with pocket pairs and suited combos. So on this board, villain could have a number of king X and lower pairs, including many with a heart, as well as some straights, sets, and two pairs. Accordingly, we see that villain has, for the most part, what we refer to as a mid-heavy range, with plenty of oranges and yellows representing hands of medium equity. And so with these two conditions being met, hero having a significant likelihood of holding a strong hand, plus villain having a mid-heavy range, we see that the solver fires this massive 430% pot shove with over 7% of its range, including virtually 100% of the time with queen jack of hearts. As mentioned, for a moment I contemplated making a smaller overbet, which the solver does with a number of its flushes, but these primarily consist of flushes with a king, as it blocks one of villain's most likely calling candidates, top pair with a heart. Now some of you may be thinking that betting this large in my shoes is risky, given that it's possible that villain has a stronger flush. However, thinking about what villain could have is not the right mental framework. Instead, you should be thinking about what villain is most likely to have given the prior action. As most of you know, all decisions in poker are driven by EV, and one half of the EV equation is probability. So when deciding on whether to bet or how much to bet, our focus should primarily be on the portions of villain's range that are most probable, because these include the combos that will impact the EVs of our actions most significantly. So we know that the source of most of my win rate in river betting situations is from overbetting. What about river raising scenarios? Well, again, we see that I've been quite successful using the overbet in this node as well. I've pulled off this maneuver 12 times, won a total of 41 big blinds, and have a 3,400 big blind win rate. So let's again dig a bit deeper by taking a look at a couple hands from this scenario, this time first analyzing a hand where instead of having value, I had a bluff. So on this Queen 8-5 two-tone flop, I'll be doing a good amount of checking, as villain will have many hands with decent equity on this board. Various pairs, draws between the Queen and 8 and 8 and 5, as well as a number of flush draws. This means that I don't have a ton of fold leverage that I can utilize for protection, so I'll be playing passively with most of my underpairs. The turn pairs the 8, and villain bets small, which he could be doing with a wide array of hands. I decide to call, which the solver does with virtually all pairs in this button versus big blind formation. The river is pretty much a brick, and villain bets small again, around 50%. In my mind, this bet weighted villain's range towards weaker Queen X holdings, so I categorized my hand as a mere bluff catcher. Now, many only consider two options when bluff catching, to call or to fold. But oftentimes, bluff raising will also be a viable option for this sort of borderline hand, since the EV for both calling and folding bluff catchers will typically be 0 or close to 0. This means that raising only needs to produce a small amount of EV for it to be the best choice, and this incremental EV will usually be driven by card removal. And in this case, my particular hand blocked both 5s and 3s, so it is, according to the solver, a pure raise. Keep in mind though, that this move only works to the extent that you have value to support your bluffs, and so in this situation, I sized my raise based on what I thought would be reasonable for 8x to fire against top pair. I don't think I would have slow played many sets in this way, so I didn't want to go too big. And this is a critical point that goes back to one of the fundamentals we discussed in a prior video, horizontal balance, which refers to the tactic of splitting hands of similar strength into different lines to ensure that you have a variety of hand strengths in various branches of the game tree. Remember, if you want to utilize a game theoretic approach, you can't just cherry pick certain moves you want to employ. The EVs and strategies of any sim are inextricably tied to the assumption that both players are playing in a certain way. This means that if you want to play a theoretic-based strategy, you need to internalize the fundamental basics holistically because they all work together in unison as one comprehensive framework. So this raises the question, do I actually in practice slow play strong hands in position? And the answer is emphatically yes, as will be demonstrated by this next river raising example. So this hand starts off multi-way, and we don't have any pre-flop ranges that include a small blind 3-bet cold calling range, so for purposes of our analysis, we just gave the small blind the same calling range as under the gun, which won't be perfect, but it probably won't matter too much given that the small blind folded on the flop to my c-bet, which I will be doing a lot of on this king-high board in position as the pre-flop aggressor in a 3-bet pot. The turn is the 8 of diamonds, under the gun checks, and then I decide to check back. Now obviously, holding the nuts, my goal was to play for stacks. However, at the same time, I recognized that I had many hands that would want to check back this turn, such as pocket queens, jacks, and 10s, as well as some strong aces like ace-queen and ace-jack without a heart. And so based on the principle of horizontal balance, I knew that I would want to add at least a few traps to protect my checking line, and determined that top set would likely be the best candidate as it blocks a significant chunk of villain's potential calling range. And as we can see, out of all the nutted hands over pairs plus, the only combo that the solver checks back with is pocket kings. The river is the 10 of clubs, and villain bets out 75%, and obviously shoving here with pocket kings was a no-brainer. As for bluffs, I think some decent raising candidates could have been something like ace-10 or queen-10, or maybe ace-3 or 7-6. Now the most interesting aspect of this hand was that villain called this overbet shove with just pocket fives, which I think is a strong testament to the power of playing with some level of balance, even at these stakes against massive fish like this. Most likely in villain's mind, he simply did not believe that I would have checked back a nutted hand on the turn, so he decided to look me up. If instead I barreled the turn, I think there would have been a good chance that he would have just folded, but by employing horizontal balance and then blasting the river, I was able to maximize my EV. So hopefully these few examples have shown how making oversized river bets can be quite profitable, and will help some of you get over the hurdle of worrying about scaring away villain with huge bets. We can't control what villain will do, but if you play with a fundamentally sound strategy, your game will be effective regardless.